Hey guys, imagine stumbling into a medieval tavern, dim lighting flickering off rough-hewn wooden beams, the smell of stale ale and roasted boar lingering in the air, and the soundtrack of drunken laughter mixed with the clash of tankards. Yeah, it's basically the 14th century version of your local dive bar, minus the Yelp reviews and craft cocktails. You try to order a goblet of wine, and suddenly you're part of a raucous jester's game, or maybe a fight over who's the better knight. Spoiler, probably neither was wearing armor. Before we dive into drunken bales of hay and questionable hygiene, hit that like button if you're into stories from the past. And tell me in the comments if you'd last a night in a place like this, or if you'd bail faster than a rotted plank. Now strap in, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to a night at the medieval tavern. Cheers. A tired traveler named Aldrich, with shoulders bowed under a heavy burden of miles, gently pushed open the massive wooden door of the Rose and Hound. The latch protested softly, releasing a faint creak that lingered in the cool air, which smelled faintly of dampness, burnt candle wax, and stale bread. Stepping inside, he paused briefly to let his eyes adjust to the dim flicker of nearby candles, noticing the uneven planks beneath his feet and the faint murmur of distant conversations. He felt the slow crawl of exhaustion as the hum of a simple, bustling tavern welcomed him into its tired, familiar embrace. An unspoken acknowledgement hung in the space that here, amid rough wood and quiet shadows, stories both trivial and profound had quietly unfolded through the ages. As Aldrich settled onto a rough-hewn bench, he felt the subtle weight of the room's tension. The shifting patterns of merchants exchanging goods, soldiers with wary eyes, and locals lost in their own quiet routines. Greta, the grizzled barkeep, watched him with small, unintrusive movements, pouring ale with a practiced hand, and replying minimally to the few questions that rose from the bar. The air grew slightly denser with the sense of roasted meat and fermented grains, warm yet heavy, with the occasional clink of tankards and muffled laughter. There was a quiet awareness that this inn, small as it was, served a purpose beyond mere hospitality. It was a crossroads for lives always in transit, a pause in stories that were often unremarkable, yet inevitably intertwined. Aldrich's gaze drifted to the flickering shadows cast by the candles, where the blurred faces of prophets, or perhaps witnesses, seemed to linger behind the obscuring light. Greta's face remained expressionless, her eyes hinting at stories behind her stern exterior. There was a small irony in the scene. The tavern, a place of fleeting encounters, was also a site of comfort for those who returned night after night, seeking familiarity amid chaos. Small exchanges of words fluttered around like moths, insignificant yet oddly reassuring. The hum of conversation clatter of tankards and the crackle of the hearth blended into a lullaby of mundane human persistence, unhurried and quietly accepting of life's persistent sameness. Aldrich leaned back against the rough wood, feeling the slow, calming rhythm of the tavern settle over him. The room's quiet hum became a gentle heartbeat, steady and unremarkable. His weariness ebbed as he listened to the muted voices, watching a young serve-woman stifle a yawn while balancing a tray. Around him, the tavern offered small windows into human routine. A soldier absent-mindedly sharpening a dagger, a merchant counting coins with a distracted smile, neighbors exchanging muted greetings. In this space of low light and soft sounds, the chaos of the outside world felt far away, replaced by the subtle comfort of human imperfection. It was a place not of grand stories, but of quiet endurance and simple continuity. As the evening wore on, Aldrich mused quietly on the slow rhythm of life here, noticing how the tavern's timeless quiet held both familiarity and melancholy. Faces blurred behind the warm glow of candlelight, stories untold behind inscrutable eyes, all blending into the gentle tapestry of ordinary human life. Gretel, the barkeep, continued her subtle watch, her face rarely changing, but her presence a steady reassurance. Outside, the night stretched calmly, indifferent to the minutes passing like waves on a quiet shore. The tavern, with its modest, unspoken traditions, seemed to stand as a humble monument to the persistent human tendency to seek refuge, not in grand legends, but in the simple act of surviving day after day in the slow, silent river of history. Aldrich settled onto a wooden bench near the hearth, the tavern's warm glow spilling over his rough cloth tunic as the low hum of conversation and the strum of a lute filled the air. Patrons leaned into their mugs, sharing stories old and new, their faces relaxed and lined with quiet weariness. The scent of roasted grains and spilled ale mingled softly, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of these rural gatherings, a simple, steady pulse of human life. Outside, the evening light faded behind shuttered windows, leaving the room slightly dim but cozy, a small world of hardened feet and tired smiles. The minstrel's melody wavered and drifted through the crowded space, a gentle reminder that even amidst chaos, there was a quiet, enduring longing for comfort and connection. As the evening deepened, a sudden rise in voices drew Aldrich's attention, a heated debate over a dice game that escalated with expectant, raised voices, and the clatter of coins and small wooden cups. Hands trembled lightly as a stranger cloaked in dark leaned closer, whispering something inaudible, yet obviously important, into a nearby ear. A scatter of patrons eagerly watched the unfolding tension, eyes flickering between the game and the stranger's hidden face, shadows obscuring his features beneath a hood. The jovial atmosphere threatened to fracture into something sharper, more unpredictable, as the wager grew higher and tempers frayed. The room's warm hum shifted into a delicate tension, a fragile balance on the edge of disquiet, a reminder of how quickly conviviality can curdle into discord over something as mundane as a lost die. Within the room, irony took its place, an unspoken comedy that only age and distance could appreciate. As a loud bounce of a spilled mug interrupted a serious wager, prompting a clash over spilled ale and wounded pride, a burly man, reddened from drink, swung out in frustration, knocking over a chair and narrowly missing a server's plate. The crowd hesitated, then grew louder, some chuckling softly at the absurdity, others scoffing at the disturbance. The cloaked stranger's secretive whisper seemed all but forgotten, drowned beneath the chaos of spilled drinks and flailing arms. It was an ordinary spectacle, yet beneath the surface, it revealed the human fondness for small conflicts and the gentle resilience of the tavern's familiar chaos, as if life's small frictions kept the room's warmth ticking just a little longer. The tavern's tumult gradually subsided into a calmer murmur. The brawl, like many before it, left behind only a lingering sense of tired amusement. Aldrich moved slightly, adjusting his seat to better listen to the settling sounds, cushions settling, mugs replaced, patrons sighing and exchanging tired glances. The ale's scent still filled the air, now tinged with a faint trace of spilled stories. Quietly, a few remained engaged in hushed conversations, while others stared into their cups, lost in thought or perhaps recollections of simpler days. The stranger's shadowy figure had vanished into the background, replaced by a gentle, familiar hum of life returning to its usual, slow pace. In this moment, the tavern felt like a small island of peace amid the ordinary, ongoing narrative of human imperfection. As the night stretched onward, Aldrich found himself quietly pondering the scene, how such ordinary chaos and calm coexisted within these ancient walls, echoing the unchanging flow of human folly and patience. The faces around him, weary yet enduring, seemed quietly to mirror his own slow, unhurried thoughts, each person carrying their small stories of spilled ale, hurried whispers, and fleeting joys. The flickering light cast soft shadows over their weary features, as if to remind him that beneath the surface of everyday life, there is an enduring humanity, flawed, humorous, and quietly resilient. Slowly he drained his mug, feeling the stillness settle like dust, the kind that settles and waits, quietly, for another day to begin its soft, unremarkable cycle, and in that gentle pause, he found a kind of humility, a recognition that all human stories are fleeting whispers in a long, slow breeze. As the dust settled in the old tavern, Greta leaned close to Aldrich and softly recounted a whisper from the night's chaos. There was, she claimed, a hidden cellar beneath the uneven wooden floorboards. In that dim space, she said, contraband wines rested in shadows, and old relics, long forbidden, were concealed from the eyes of any passing authority. Aldrich, curious as always, felt the promise of discovery stir within him, a quiet thrill that beckoned through the scent of stale ale and sweaty timber. The tavern's aged beams seemed to murmur with stories, but Greta's eye was fixed on the floor, where a loose plank hid more than just dirt. Without much hesitation, or perhaps to escape the mundane, Aldrich resolved to see for himself what secrets lay buried beneath. Darkness beckoned him, slow and silent, as he slipped away from the gathered murmur, heading toward the creaking stairs that led downward. The stairs groaned softly under his cautious steps, echoing faintly in the silent space below, where shadows clung to every cracked wall and uneven stone. Aldrich's hands brushed over the rough-hewn surface as he descended, feeling the cold air seep into his bones and the faint smell of aged wine and damp earth. In the faint light, he spotted a sturdy iron door etched with a strange, worn riddle, its words faded, but still legible enough to hint at a secret. His fingers traced the uneven carvings as he pondered their meaning, discovering that this was no ordinary storage. It was guarded by more than mere iron. Somewhere between anticipation and slight unease, he remembered Greta's whispered warnings. Yet the lure of mystery proved too tempting to resist. With a calming breath, he prepared to unlock whatever lay beyond, hesitating for just a moment in the cool gloom. In a quiet twist of irony, the locked chest behind the ancient door seemed almost unimposing, its rusty latch holding back centuries of secrecy. The riddle's words, partially obscured by years of soot and grime, suggested a puzzle of weight and patience. Aldrich's fingers fumbled over the cold metal lock as a faint smirk touched his lips, recognizing that even the most cunning secrets might just hinge on simple truths. He wondered who had crafted this trap, perhaps a long-forgotten tavern keeper, or a cautious merchant, both of whom had likely chuckled at their own cleverness. Meanwhile, the room remained still, holding its breath, as the quiet hum of someone's unseen thoughts filled the space. It was a reminder that even in the quietest moments, humans could craft small, ironic barriers between discovery and concealment. Finally, with a soft click that seemed almost reluctant, the lock yielded, Aldrich pushed the heavy lid open to reveal a modest stash of dusty bottles and faded relics. The air was thick with the weight of silence, as if the room itself was quietly amused by its own secrecy, holding delicate memories just out of reach. He paused, marveling at how ordinary items, an empty wine jug, a tarnished brooch, could carry the weight of history, quietly enduring beneath layers of dust and time. In this stillness, he appreciated the gentle calm of forgotten stories, slowly shifting in the quiet glow of his lantern. The irony was subtle. Humans often spent lifetimes guarding what they couldn't truly own, hiding their treasures just enough to forget where they hid them in the first place. And here he was, simply one more visitor in a very long line of those seeking something just beyond grasp. As he backed away from the hidden cache, Aldrich reflected on the slow days when secrets might have seemed more vital, but now felt only slightly absurd, like relics from a simpler, quieter time. The tavern, with its tired beams and flickering candles, seemed to breathe a gentle acknowledgement of human imperfection, of the slow human tendency to hide and discover in equal measure. Greta's whispered tip had illuminated a small corner of that endless cycle, reminding him that every secret was only a pause in history's relentless march. He ascended the creaking stairs, feeling the weight of modesty and humor settle around him like a well-worn cloak, ready for the next quiet human folly. Below, the shadows continued their slow vigil, holding their acquiescent secrets close, as history, tired and bemused, murmured softly into the night. Sometimes, he thought, the stories worth remembering are those in which nothing grand happens, just quiet moments stitched into the fabric of everyday life. As the evening shadows stretched across the weathered wooden beams of the tavern, Aldrich settled into a quiet corner, the flickering lantern casting gentle glows on his thoughtful face. The tavern's warmth was slow to fade, and the distant hum of low conversation offered a soothing backdrop to his minor pursuit, the solving of a simple riddle inscribed on a weathered parchment. When he finally cracked the code and lifted the old iron latch, the weight of the chest was surprisingly light. Inside, a fragile, worn map revealed itself, its ink faded but still legible, pointing to an ancient passage long forgotten. It felt in some small way like unearthing a secret long buried beneath layers of dust and time, familiar yet distant. Around him, the tavern's quiet hum persisted, unaware of the small, human act of uncovering history, and perhaps a passing sense of purpose. Here, amid the slow turning of night's quiet wheel, the story paused, tinged with the silent satisfaction of discovery. No sooner had Aldrich begun to consider the significance of his find did an abrupt shadow fall across the table, and a cloaked figure appeared from the darkness, voice low and deliberate. The stranger's eyes, hidden behind a thick veil of fabric and shadow, demanded the map with a quiet urgency that felt both calm and oddly commanding. Aldrich hesitated. The flickering lantern cast elongated shapes on the stone wall, transforming the encounter into a slow, surreal dance of trust and suspicion. The room remained still, except for the soft creak of the tavern's old wooden floorboards and the muffled sigh of wind outside, pressing against the small windows. In that moment, the peaceful night, once filled with mundane camaraderie, now teetered on the edge of quiet conflict, where the human desire for curiosity clashed unexpectedly with the cold hand of necessity or threat. A gentle, almost ironical tension filled the air, as if history itself was tired of such petty standoffs. Aldrich's fingers hovered over the map, his mind racing with thoughts of the absurdity of it all, the silent irony that such a simple discovery could suddenly evoke a confrontation. The stranger's shadow loomed larger, shadowed by the flickering lantern, and in that small, compressed space, the tension seemed to fold in on itself like the worn pages of an old book. The thief's demand was flat, businesslike. Yet, beneath the words lurked a faded sense of purpose, as if centuries of secret dealings had led to this quiet, unassuming tavern. For a moment, Aldrich wondered if he had stumbled into some elaborate jest of history, where even the stakes were trivial, yet utterly human ambition, fear, and the strange comfort of routine. The silent room seemed to breathe in slow, deliberate rhythms, and the entire scene, strangely, felt both profoundly mundane and subtly absurd. What is treasure, after all, in such a sleepy corner of time? Slowly, Aldrich made his choice, hands steady, but heart quietly aware of the fragile balance hanging over the table. The stranger's gaze, hidden beneath the dark fabric, lingered briefly as the quiet resolve settled in his expression. With a sigh that seemed to acknowledge the endless patience of history, Aldrich carefully closed the chest, the sound muffled by thick cloth and old wood, a soft, almost insignificant noise in the grand scheme. The lantern's glow softened, casting a warm, muted light on their silent standstill, as if the room itself was taking a breath after the tension. In that moment, the absurdity of human conflicts over small things became almost gentle, like the slow drift of a cloud across an otherwise calm sky. Human flaws, fleeting moments of power, and shared quiet resignation. The night pressed on steadily, indifferent to the small victory of patience, and quiet descended once more. Later, as the tavern grew still, and the shadows stretched longer, Aldrich remained seated with the map safely tucked away. Pondering the quiet irony of it, all the unnoticed, unremarkable passage of history, punctuated by human moments, both trivial and profound. The old chest sat silently beside him, a relic of curiosity and caution. Much like the stories that layers of time tend to forget, stories about quiet human endeavors, fleeting rivalries, and the slow, inevitable drift toward memory. Outside, the stars shimmered faintly through the small window, indifferent to the small dramas played out beneath their cold light. There was a certain gentle melancholy in knowing that such stories, unremarkable yet meaningful, persisted through quiet acts and whispered confrontations, all part of the slow, unbending march of history. And so the night relaxed, settling into that slow, gentle rhythm, quietly witness to the human comedy of everyday life long gone. In the dim light of the tavern's interior, Aldrich arrived with a slow, deliberate pace, clutching a worn parchment that he hoped would grant passage through perilous regions. The air was thick with the scent of stale ale and roasted bread, and the murmurs of patrons created a gentle hum against the creaking wooden beams. His eyes, tired yet determined, scanned the rough faces seated around rough tables, knowing that this small act of negotiation might determine his journey's fate. As he approached the barkeep, a robust figure with a weathered face, the atmosphere softened ever so slightly in anticipation of the conversation to come. It was a quiet moment between the clink of mugs and the faint crackle of a dying fire, where hope and pragmatism exchanged silent glances. The tension mounted as the barkeep and Aldrich conversed in hushed tones, negotiating over the fragile parchment and the ale that had yet to be poured. The patrons nearby, sensing a subtle shift, paused their drinking to listen, their faces blurred with interest and boredom in equal measure. Words were exchanged slowly, as if each syllable carried weight beyond its sound. The map's value was weighed against a mug of the tavern's finest ale, a practical currency in this unremarkable place. Eventually, the barkeep's eyes, shadowed and unreadable, flicked toward Aldrich with a quiet nod, an uncertain agreement that sealed both passage and the exchange of a frothy flagon. Outside, the night pressed in, indifferent to the small human bargains made within. Aldrich, now holding his newly acquired map and a hefty mug of ale, felt an ironic sense of victory settle over him, an improbable victory born from simple barter rather than battle. He lifted the mug in a slow, deliberate gesture, offering a silent toast to the uncertain road ahead. The tavern's patrons, some weary, some amused, cheered quietly and raised their own mugs in a mild, collective acknowledgement of human persistence. Greta, a weathered woman behind the bar, clasped her hands together with a soft smile, and her eyes flickered with a quiet camaraderie that spoke of countless such nights. As Aldrich's gaze drifted between the flickering fire and the open door leading into the cold night, he recognized that this modest act of diplomacy had somehow woven itself into the fabric of his journey, a reminder of the fleeting comfort found amid chaos. Stepping back into the cool, quiet night, Aldrich paused briefly at the threshold of the tavern, feeling the weight of the warm camaraderie behind him and the silent, unwelcoming darkness ahead. The stars, faint and distant, seemed to acknowledge his small victory with a flicker of distant light, while the uneven cobblestones beneath his feet told silent stories of countless others who had passed this way. His shoulders, relaxed just enough to carry the map and a clenched mug, carried him onward into the night, his journey marked forever by the memory of warm ales, cautious bargains, and the faint hum of human connection in a mundane world. The distant sounds of the tavern, the clatter of mugs, gentle laughter, faded into the cold silence, a quiet reassurance that even the smallest human moments endured in the grand, tired march of history. Later, as he walked beneath the muted glow of moonlight, Aldrich reflected on what had transpired, a simple exchange that had embodied a common truth. Humans, in their imperfection, seek connection and solace in small acts of trust. The map, now tucked safely away, represented more than a path through dangerous lands. It symbolized the quiet resilience of those who exchange mundane promises and modest rewards amid the ongoing, unremarkable passage of life. The night was calm, indifferent to the fleeting dramas of travelers and taverns alike. Yet, in this quietness lay a certain comfort, an acknowledgement that even in the most ordinary moments, humans find meaning. As he disappeared into the dark, the memory of that humble tavern lingered gently, a reminder that warmth and camaraderie can be found even in the most unexpected places, small, fleeting, but undeniably real. As dawn gently seeped through the small, grimy windows of the oak and hearth, Aldrich was already awake, his bones settled into the slow rhythm of pre-dawn routines. He surveyed the hearthstone, cold and empty, with a faint hope for warmth later that day. Outside, the faint outlines of the village stirred. A baker's cart clattered down the muddy street, its wheels leaving small depressions in the dew. The quiet of the morning was thick with the scent of damp earth and stale straw, a reminder that time pressed on with little urgency. Aldrich's hands, calloused and slow, grasped for a rusty mug, already knowing the day would drift into the ordinary. No surprises, only the steady ticking of life's slow pulse. As the sun rose higher, The town's few travelers began to appear, their footsteps muffled on the uneven cobblestones. Some paused at the door, eyes heavy with rest, while others hurried in, seeking the brief respite of warmth and ale. Aldrich moved deliberately, pouring the first round in a steady stream, as if the act itself could slow the fleeting hours. The weight of the day's unknowns, perhaps a dispute, maybe just a long, weary journey, hung in the air, unspoken but persistent. The cheerful clatter of tankards and muffled conversations masked the subtle tension, as everyone knew well enough that nothing much would truly change, despite the hurried, insignificant dramas unfolding amid the hum of quiet interactions. A small, almost humorous irony unfolded in the way travelers eagerly sought solace in simple drink, unaware of how fleeting their respite truly was. Aldrich, leaning slightly on the serving table, watched an overly serious merchant gesture wildly while explaining his route, his face blurred in shadow as if behind an unseen curtain. A child's bright laughter, brief and bright, echoed moments before settling back into the dull comfort of everyday banter. The same old faces came and went, some cleaner than others, all carrying their small burdens beneath weary eyes that seemed to mock the urgency of their worries. Life, like the ale pouring from the spigot, was best enjoyed in slow, measured sips, if only they remembered this wisdom amidst their hurried concerns. Later in the afternoon, the tavern settled into its calmer guise, the lively chatter easing into a gentle hum. Aldrich, now seated slightly apart, let his gaze drift across the quiet room, noting the worn furniture, the patched cloths, and the simple, friendly faces. The flickering candlelight cast long, soft shadows, echoing the stillness that had settled over the hamlet, calm, expectant, but unhurried. Outside, the light dimmed into a warm hue as evening approached, and the village outside seemed to breathe a collective sigh of surrender to dusk. Despite the endless march of days, Aldrich felt no need for grand thoughts, only an appreciation for this unremarkable, human ordinariness, quietly unfolding moment by moment. As night gently descended and the tavern returned to its quiet rhythm, Aldrich softly closed a heavy wooden door behind him, the faint echo still lingering in the air. He paused briefly on the threshold, eyes slipping over the familiar, sleepy faces that had drifted into rest or silent reflection. The hearth's embers glowed faintly, casting a warm, amber light over a day that had been neither notable nor mundane, merely human in its slow persistence. Outside, the village seemed to breathe deeper, content in its quiet existence, much like the keeper himself. Aldrich's shoulders, relaxed yet heavy with another day past, carried the weight of countless such hours, each one slipping quietly into the next, in a never-ending cycle of small, essential routines. As dawn waned into midday, Aldrich, the tavern keeper, arranged wooden mugs and linen napkins behind his oak counter, the air warm and tinged with the faint scent of stale ale and last night's fire. Outside, the bustling market pulsed with stalls vying for attention, bright cloth, fresh bread, and hurried footfalls, all creating a background hum that seeped into his quiet space. He glanced at his diminishing barley supply, a simple reminder of how quickly a day could slip into unforeseen need, like a soft whisper of concern amid routine comfort. The sunlight filtering through small, cracked windows cast gentle shadows that moved lazily across his worn table, a testament to the slow passage of hours. Amidst the ordinary, Aldrich felt the quiet certainty of the day unfolding, with the slow rhythm of human life softly humming around him. Suddenly, the peaceful balance shifted as a cartload of market-bound barley failed to arrive. A common enough mishap, yet enough to cause a subtle ripple of tension in Aldrich's calm facade. His eyes flicked to the empty grain bins, the slight tightening of his jaw betraying only a faint sense of worry. Outside, a group of rowdy mercenaries barged into the tavern, their rough voices clashing with the quiet hum, demanding free drinks or a show of strength. Their loud laughter and jostling chairs echoed through the wood, testing Aldrich's patience and diplomatic skill as he silently weighed whether compliance or resistance was wise. The day's quietude now tangled with the sharp irony of human stubbornness and the unpredictable nature of small-town life, emphasizing how thin the line was between order and chaos. Amid this unruly scene, a wounded minstrel pushed through the tavern's heavy door, his face blurred beneath a shadow of a battered scarf, seeking refuge from the cold and the world's indifference. His hands trembled, clutching a broken lute, yet his eyes held a quiet plea for shelter rather than charity. Aldrich hesitated, the irony of the wounded musician longing for safety in a place more accustomed to fleeting orders and hurried transactions, settling into the slow, almost humorous realization that human suffering often arrived unannounced, wearing familiar disguises. The mercenaries' raucous demands continued, somewhat muted now, as Aldrich moved carefully to tend the minstrel's wounds. The soft sounds of cloth and gentle words filling the space. In this small act, the ordinary kindness of the day persisted, anchoring the moment in muted humility. With the wounded minstrel settled near the hearth and the rowdy group momentarily subdued, Aldrich took a slow breath, the weight of the midday chaos easing into a gentle calm that seeped into his bones. Outside, The market roiled with activity, but inside his tavern, time seemed to pause. The soft crackle of fire, the faint clink of tankards, and the quiet murmur of human voices made a fabric of quiet resilience. He considered the fragile, fleeting balance of his daily life, marked by shortages, disputes, and unexpected visitors, all woven into the routine's subtle tranquility. As the light outside grew softer and shadows lengthened, Aldrich felt a familiar, peaceful acceptance settle upon him, acknowledging that human frailty and stubbornness, like the passing hours, were simply part of the long, slow story of life. Later, as the tavern's silence stretched and the day drifted toward evening, Aldrich reflected on the quiet lessons of human imperfection, how missteps, shortages, and surprises were threads in the gentle tapestry of everyday life. The blurred faces of prophets or saints, often unseen, seemed to linger in the dim corners of his mind, their presence immunizing him from the need to judge too harshly. With a final glance at the empty grain bins and the quiet minstrel still resting, he prepared for the coming night, the familiar rhythm of pouring drinks and listening to stories. It was, after all, a day like any other, slow, imperfect, imbued with quiet humor, and in its small, mundane ways, a reflection of the enduring patience that keeps human life quietly moving forward. As dusk settled over the small tavern, Aldrich moved leisurely behind the bar, the warm glow of lanterns casting soft shadows on weathered wooden beams. The usual gentle hum of conversation wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, while outside the distant sounds of busy streets grew quieter. He knew that on evenings like this, the world outside often seemed more urgent than the quiet patience of his daily toil. His eyes flicked occasionally toward a wooden chest tucked beneath the counter, a secret that weighed lightly on his conscience. Despite the calm, he was aware that change lurked just beyond the door, waiting silently in the gathering evening air. As the hour darkened, murmurs of the approaching raid floated in from neighboring tables, their voices hushed but insistent, like waves pressing against the shore. Aldrich's heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the weight of necessity, extra weapons hidden beneath loose floorboards, carefully stowed where few would think to look. The quiet clink of metal and the faint scent of oil mingled with the smell of stale ale, creating a tapestry of subtle tension. Outside, a stray breeze rattled the shutters, as if whispering warnings the town dared not fully hear. In this moment, Electric's mind juggled the fragile balance between peace and impending conflict. Then, amidst the low hum of conversation, a small spark ignited unexpectedly in the cellar, an ember caught in a forgotten corner of the stored wood. It crackled softly, casting a flickering glow that highlighted the stored grain and the shadows on the rough stone walls. Irony settled over Aldrich's shoulders. The very act of hiding weapons now threatened the supplies that sustained him. He moved with deliberate calm, a quiet observer of his own small disaster, feeling the absurdity of human fragility in a moment as mundane as a fire. There was no panic, only measured hesitation as he reached for a bucket of sand. This was, after all, the slow rhythm of human persistence, deliberate, imperfect, quietly humorous. The flames licked uncertainly at the makeshift barrier, casting a soft orange hue across Aldrich's face as he worked to smother the blaze. Outside the cellar, the night settled into calm, punctuated only by the distant owl's hoot. He leaned back, exhausted but relieved, realizing that what might have been a crisis was merely a pause, a reminder that even chaos defers to the slow passage of time. The grain, though singed at the edges, would survive, much like the town itself, resilient in its quiet, unremarkable way. The heat in the cellar gradually ebbed, leaving behind only smoke and the faint smell of ash, while outside the world kept its gentle, sleepy rhythm. Later, as Aldrich cleaned his hands and surveyed the muted scene, he reflected on the strange poetry of ordinary life, how small events, mundane decisions, and silent fears intertwined in a slow, ongoing story. The distant voices, the flickering light, and the hidden weapons all seemed like quiet witnesses to human imperfection. He wondered if the prophets or the scribes of old ever watched quietly, their faces blurred behind veiled lights, amused by such fragile worlds. The night drew on, peaceful once again, like a long exhale after a brief, chaotic breath. And so, the tavern remained a modest lookout, keeping watch over the slow passage of days that seemed to accept their own quiet absurdity. As the evening darkened over the quiet village, the tavern remained a steady, familiar hum of routine, laughter softly spilling from its open windows, candles flickering against weathered wood. Aldrich, the tavern keeper, moved calmly behind the bar, wiping mugs with gentle pressure, unaware of the distant shadows gathering outside. The townsfolk, sensing the comfort of their daily gathering, settled into their usual corners, each absorbed in small talk that carried no hint of trouble. The scent of sour ale mingled with roasted bread, filling the air with a muted sense of ordinary life. It was one of those nights where time seemed to settle in, and the world outside the walls felt distant and benign. Then, without warning, the faint sound of shuffling footsteps and low voices pierced the calm, an unwelcome intrusion. Shadows seeped through the narrow alleyways, growing larger beneath the moon's dim glow. Aldrich's eyes fixed on the door as the first rough hands pushed through, and the quiet of routine shattered into a tense, vulnerable silence. The villagers shifted uneasily, instinctively clutching lips, or gripping EMPT, white Chinese letter, as the threat of violence loomed in the cold night air. The boisterous chatter faded into whispers of uncertainty, and the once peaceful scene now trembled with a fragile anticipation. Amidst this, Aldrich silently prepared himself for the coming clash, knowing that even in moments of crisis, the mundane had turned into a quiet battlefield. There was an odd, almost humorous irony in how the raiders, so eager with their crude weapons and shouts, underestimated the familiarity and perhaps the defenses of the humble tavern. As they stormed inside, expecting chaos, they found Aldrich already pulling aside a loose stone in the wall, revealing a narrow passage. Secretly, the villagers slipped into the dusty, hidden corridor, their footsteps muffled but deliberate. Outside, the raiders fumbled in confusion, knocking over a chair or tripping over a loose floorboard, as the mundane became unexpectedly dramatic. The absurdity of the situation, these fierce enemies battling echoes of everyday life, lingered like a quiet smirk in the shadows, a simple, human moment of irony in a night fraught with danger. In the sparse, candle-lit refuge behind the hidden door, a calm settled that felt almost surreal. The villagers, now out of sight, but aware of their silent refuge, listened to the muffled chaos outside, shouts muffled behind thick walls, the scrape of weapons against wood, a distant crash or two. Aldrich's steady voice urged patience, a quiet reassurance amidst the tension. Eventually, the sounds of the raid faltered, returning to the cold silence of the night, and the village's fragile tranquility persisted. Inside, the people exhaled slowly, their faces relaxed but cautious, as the night's disturbance dissolved into mere memory. The silent refuge offered them a momentary break from the absurd human drama unfolding just beyond reach. As dawn's first light seeped through small cracks in the wall, the villagers emerged slowly, blinking against the pale glow, some with dirt-streaked faces, others with weary smiles of relief. The tavern, now silent and still, bore the marks of the night's chaos: scattered chairs, a crooked lantern, and an air of subdued reflection. Aldrich looked around with calm resignation, acknowledging the fragile edge between safety and vulnerability that defined their lives. In the quiet aftermath, they returned to their modest routines, knowing well that peace was often just a brief pause amid ongoing human folly. With hearts slightly heavier, but spirits unbroken, they resumed the slow rhythm of everyday life, quietly amused by the fleeting absurdity of their night's ordeal. At the break of dawn, Aldrich, the tavern keeper, awoke to the faint glow of sunlight filtering through the small, churned glass windows. The air was still warm from the previous night, carrying the faint aroma of damp wood and the lingering trace of last evening's mead. As he carefully stepped over scattered planks and broken pottery, he noticed the faint scars of the night's chaos, a few cracked chairs, and a smudged hearth. Despite the quiet, there was a quiet sense of resolve settling within him, a gentle recognition that another day had begun in this slow, unyielding rhythm of village life. The distant sounds of dawn birds stirring, a nearby cow lowing, reminded him that life was unhurried, even in moments of trouble. By mid-morning, the village's last raiders had been driven away, their retreat marked only by a few disturbed thatch and faint footprints in the dirt. Aldrich moved with a calm purpose, tending to the battered hearth that had taken a blow during the chaos. The small fireplace was patched with a scrap of old cloth and some remaining clay, its cracks comforting in their imperfection. As he set out a simple meal of bread, cheese, and thin ham, enough to share, but nothing lavish, other villagers arrived, their faces tired yet grateful. Conversations were quiet, more nods than words, each person reflecting on the night's quiet ordeal that tested their patience rather than their strength. The whole scene felt oddly mundane, yet woven with the unspoken bond of shared survival. There was an irony in the way the day's troubles faded into the background, replaced by the soft hum of routine. The clatter of a ceramic cup, the scrape of a knife on wood, the gentle chiding of children playing outside. Aldrich chuckled softly at a small joke shared by one of the villagers about the misplaced bucket that had nearly become a weapon. The shadows of the afternoon grew long, casting the tavern in a warm, dull light, while the outside world carried on with unhurried patience. Even the prophet's face, usually hidden in shadow or blurred by time, seemed to smile faintly at the tame chaos of human smallness. Reality's slow, unpretentious irony settled over the room, reminding everyone that life had a curious way of moving forward, even after the greatest upheaval. As dusk approached, Aldrich took a moment to sit quietly by the repaired hearth, feeling the warmth seep into his hands and bones. Around him, the tired but assembled villagers settled into the rhythm of quiet sustenance, some nursing cups of stale ale, others silently mend their garments or stare into the flickering fire. The air was filled with a soothing, muted hum of everyday life, with no grand drama, only the steady passage of time. Outside, the light turned a soft orange hue that seemed to whisper calm into the slightly silenced village. Aldrich gazing into the glow, found comfort in the simple acts, stoking the fire, passing bread, sharing fleeting glances. This moment of calm was neither profound nor trivial, just quietly enough to cradle the village into peaceful anticipation of another tomorrow. In the stillness of the night, with the hearth's last embers fading softly, Aldrich reflected on the day's events with a gentle sense of resilience. The chaos had come and gone, leaving only faint scars and a story of survival, quietly stitched into the fabric of everyday life. There was no grand lesson, only the slow understanding that human effort, no matter how modest, was enough to carry them through moments of hardship. Behind the blurred prophet's face, perhaps a faint smile, implying that hope often resides in routine, patience, and the unremarkable hours of peaceful dawns. As sleep settled over the village, Aldrich listened to the distant, familiar sounds of the night, knowing that the morning would wake quietly, just as it always did, with steady, unassuming promise. In the quiet hours of early evening, the young minstrel Aldrich arrived at the Green Dragon alehouse, his worn boots softly scuffing against the uneven wooden floor. The room was filled with the low hum of conversation, the clink of mugs, and the warm glow of flickering candles. Maud, the seasoned barkeep, watched him with half-closed eyes, her face partly shadowed by the hanging lanterns, as if she had seen countless travelers pass through these doors before. Aldrich's voice was tentative as he asked for permission to perform. A small ripple of nervous expectation in his chest. Across the room, a ragtag troupe of wandering performers sat listening, their faces listless yet attentive, waiting for something unspoken to happen. The alehouse was a place of quiet gathering, where stories and songs blended softly into the background of human routines. As the evening darkened, Aldrich began to sing, his voice mellow and unrefined, weaving a simple melody that drifted like smoke through the crowded space. The other patrons, initially distracted, started to listen. A few scowled, but mostly leaned in, some tapping fingers on tables or swaying slightly. Maud watched from behind her bar, her expression unreadable beneath the dim light, as if she had seen many such moments before, small displays of human longing and longing for connection. The wandering performers joined in with soft harmonies, their faces blurred by the shadowy surroundings, their voices blending into a gentle chorus. For a while, it seemed as if the alehouse had stillness and patience, holding space between human beings who, despite their differences, shared this fragile, fleeting unity. The room's quiet hum persisted, offering a rare moment of collective calm amid ordinary distraction. Then, somewhat ironically, in the midst of shared song, an awkward burst of laughter erupted from a corner. momentarily shifting the mood. A patron, perhaps overly optimistic or simply tired, laughed loudest at a poorly sung verse or a crooked note, breaking the smooth flow of music. The performers paused, faces unchanging, shadows playing on their features, as if unaffected by the small ripple of humor. Maud simply poured herself a mug of ale, her face a mask of mild boredom, letting the moment pass as quietly as it had arrived. The others resumed their listening, now with a faint smile or a shrug, recognizing the imperfect but genuine atmosphere. The alehouse's charm lay in its imperfections, human and unpretentious, a silent acknowledgement of life's unscripted surprises. Gradually, as the night wore on, the music softened, the players settling into a gentle rhythm that seemed to embrace the slow pulse of the room. The shifting light, the warm scent of bread and ale, and the soft sound of hushed conversations created a calming backdrop, almost like a lullaby for the weary. Maud wiped down the counters with measured, absent-minded strokes, her face showing not indifference, but a quiet understanding of this simple human rhythm. The patrons, now more relaxed, shared glances and small smiles, some perhaps lost in their thoughts or memories. The alehouse had become a quiet sanctuary where music did its subtle work, binding strangers through shared vulnerability and lullabies, however imperfect, into fleeting communion. It was, in its own way, a gentle reminder that even transient moments of unity matter. Reflecting on that evening, one might see the alehouse as a quiet theater of human connection, where music's power to bridge gaps was neither grand nor loud, but softly woven into the fabric of ordinary life. The faces blurred by flickering candlelight were no longer just strangers. They were witnesses to a fleeting but sincere moment of togetherness. Aldrich lingered longer than planned, a small smile on his face as he packed his lute away, feeling somehow more connected despite his own doubts. Maud returned to her usual calm, eyeing the empty mugs and the lingering glow of the hearth, knowing that such nights, quiet and unassuming, held a stubborn and humble truth that shared humanity is often found in the slow, imperfect rhythm of everyday life. The alehouse doors closed gently behind the last patrons, leaving only the soft echo of music and murmured goodbyes in the night's stillness. As the evening deepened in the modest alehouse, the flickering hearth cast gentle shadows on weathered wooden walls, and patrons settled into their well-worn benches, expecting melodic comfort. Aldrich, a seasoned lute player with a faint smile, strummed softly, filling the space with familiar tunes, while a mysterious figure named Selene entered quietly, her face partly obscured by a low hood, carrying an air of calm confidence. The air was thick with the scent of ale and bread, and a hush fell over the room as the two prepared to share a musical moment. A simple exchange of human artistry that seemed to require no more than patience and presence. Suddenly, a spirited challenge arose when Aldrich and Selene, both gently humbling each other's melodies, launched into a lute duel, their fingers dancing across strings with increasing intensity. The room's warmth was tempered by the growing tension, and a faint draught sneaked through a cracked window, causing the flames in the hearth to flicker erratically, as if discomforting the performers and patrons alike. The music waned briefly, replaced by quiet glances and sideways smiles, while the situation subtly shifted from harmony to an unspoken contest, each trying to outplay the other amidst the unpredictable gusts that threatened to extinguish their small, shared world. Irony settled in as the draught, accompanied by a sudden gust, swept across the room, flickering out the hearth's light and making the fire's glow look uncertain and small. The juggler, mid-spin, froze with a drooping balloon, and a fire-breather's torch sputtered dangerously, forcing the performers into a moment of improvised calm. A wave of light-hearted chuckles rippled through the crowd as they watched the entertainers scramble for makeshift solutions. Rugs were lifted, and blankets draped hastily over the hearth, while the patrons quietly rose to form a circle, sharing their cloaks and warmth in a silent act of community and quiet irony. The fight to maintain warmth became a gentle reminder of shared human imperfection. With the draught subdued and the fire rekindled, a sense of acceptance settled over the alehouse, the performers resuming their places as if nothing unusual had transpired. The lute music was softer now, more introspective, fitting the slow, lingering evening as the patrons leaned in slightly closer, their faces reflecting a common patience. Selene's features blurred in shadow, her smile faint yet genuine, while Aldrich's eyes were calm, almost amused by the unpredictability of the night. They played on quietly, their music becoming a gentle background to the murmurs of shared stories and the muted clinking of tankards, a peaceful pause in the nightly human rhythm. In these humble moments, it became clear that the alehouse, for all its small dramas and fleeting tensions, was a quiet mirror of everyday life, filled with imperfections and understated humor. People came for simple pleasures, a song, a laugh, warmth, a fragile human need expressed in slow, imperfect gestures. As the evening waned, the room settled into a calm reflection, a reminder that even in moments of minor chaos, there was a quiet dignity in simply carrying on, in accepting the draught and the fire's flicker, and in recognizing that perhaps that was enough to make the night gentle and human. In the quiet of the late afternoon, the wooden walls of the alehouse resonated with a familiar ballad, its melody recalling a long-forgotten clash on distant fields. The townsfolk gathered closely, their voices blending softly with the old song, as if hesitant to disturb the gentle rhythm of the evening. Somewhere in the background, a flickering candle cast a warm, uneven glow over weathered faces and empty mugs. It was an ordinary scene, yet beneath the mundane surface, a subtle sense of shared history lingered, unspoken, but felt. The song's words drifted into the air, unmoored from any particular memory, yet somehow still tethered to the stories everyone carried in shadows and silence. As night fell deeper, a shadow moved quietly among the tables, an uncanny figure whose eyes kept flicking towards the wall where the alehouse's ledger was kept. Rumors of secret song royalties had always floated lightly here, but now a whisper of suspicion thickened the air, stirring old rivalries that had lain dormant for years. The covert agent, cloaked in a plain cloak and trying to appear casual, nudged aside a mug to peek behind a loose stone on the wall. The tension sharpened just enough to make the cracked plaster feel colder, and those gathered sensed that something was unfolding beneath their tranquil gathering, something that might threaten the simple peace they cherished. Irony settled quietly as Aldrich and Maud, long-standing patrons and friends of the alehouse, caught sight of the suspicious visitor and recognized his hurried glances. With a small, knowing exchange, they realized that their old rivalries and the treasure they secretly protected could be exposed by one careless move. In the dim light, they devised subtle distractions. Aldrich staged a clumsy attempt to knock over a tray of empty plates, while Maud hummed an off-key tune intended to drown out any eavesdropping. The scene, seemingly mundane, revealed their cleverness, turning the danger into an almost humorous game of misdirection. The ordinary became a small act of defiance, cloaked in quiet irony. After the disturbance, the alehouse settled into a calm rhythm once more. Mugs clinked softly, and the old ballad resumed its gentle flow. The covert agent, thwarted for now, retreated into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint echo of muffled footsteps and a lingering sense of watchfulness. Aldrich and Maud exchanged faint smiles, their pleasure in the small victory wrapped in a calm silence that felt almost timeless. The room took on a quieter, more introspective mood, as if everyone knew that secrets, like old songs, had a way of lingering in the edges of memory. In the waning light, the alehouse seemed to breathe a quiet sigh, accepting the day's minor chaos as part of its slow, enduring rhythm. Looking back, it was all just another ordinary evening in a long chain of similar nights, people sharing simple pleasures, stories drifting lazily between shadows and lamplight. The song continued, unaltered in its gentle insistence, whispering of battles and secrets long past, yet somehow still relevant in its quiet irony. The alehouse remained a place where human imperfection mattered more than perfection itself, where cleverness was shown in small acts and patience in waiting for the next story. Somewhere, unseen faces of prophets or poets remained blurred, their true expressions hidden, but their presence felt like a steady, comforting hum beneath the surface of everyday life. It was, in its own slow way, a story of resilience, ordinary, imperfect, human, drifting into the night. On any quiet evening in the medieval alehouse, the flickering candles cast a warm, flickering glow over wooden tables where villagers whispered and sipped their ales, waiting for the night's entertainment to begin. The air carried a faint scent of sour bread, damp wool, and spilled ale, blending with the soft hum of conversations and the distant strum of a lute. But as darkness deepened and the tavern's usual warmth settled, a subtle rustling signaled the arrival of the evening's musicians and performers, their simple instruments gathering gentle light under the low ceiling. It was a time when, amid the undisturbed routine of daily life, the alehouse transformed momentarily into a stage for sound and memory. The faces in the crowd, blurred by the warm shadows, looked on patiently, unaware that the night's calm was about to shift into something altogether different. Suddenly, a rustling outside the door alerted the patrons to the arrival of heavily armored men, their heavy boots echoing on the wooden planks as they pushed inside. The peace of the evening fractured, murmurs turned into tense silence. The men, representing an agent of authority, had come with the intent of interruption, possibly for a supposed violation, or simply to assert control. As they barked commands, a ripple of anxious energy spread through the room. The musicians hesitated, their fingers frozen on strings, while others leaned back quietly, eyes narrowed slightly at the unwelcome intrusion. The crowd, normally passive, was now caught between rebellion and resignation, as tension grew like a slow-filling draft in the room. Amidst the rising chaos, Aldrich, a seasoned bard known for his sharp wit, leaned into the moment with quiet irony. As the soldiers brandished their weapons and brandished their authority, he deftly plucked a low, steady note on his lute, turning the violent disruption into a languid, almost mockery of a tune. His voice, soft and measured, began to chant a mischievous verse, inviting the intruders into a frenzied dance rather than a confrontation. The soldiers, confused by the unexpected calm and odd melody, wavered in their hostility. The crowd, sensing the shift, responded with hesitant claps and murmured laughter, their murmurs blending into the ragged rhythm of the improvised performance. Slowly, the strange, ironic unity of music began to drown out the soldiers' commands, replacing violence with a temporary, fragile camaraderie. As the improvised performance grew more elaborate, Aldrich led the crowd, and the soldiers alike through a bizarre, hesitant dance of noise and motion, turning aggression into an unintentional form of celebration. The soldiers, overwhelmed by the rhythm and the collective will of the alehouse, found themselves caught in the silliness of the moment, their stern faces unreadable, but their stance softened by the playful chaos. The clamor of drums, flutes, and shouted verses swelled, filling every corner with an absurdity that seemed to momentarily erase the boundaries of authority. When the agent finally, somewhat sheepishly, began to lower his weapon, it was less from defeat and more from the realization that the room, now humming with laughter and accidental harmony, refused to be subdued. Peace, such as it was, had quietly reasserted itself amid the oddest of symphonies. In the calm that followed, the alehouse sat quiet once more, the artists and patrons exchanging knowing glances beneath the flickering lantern light. The night recorded another simple tale of human endurance and humor. How, even in moments of tension, a little music and a shared absurdity could dissolve the gravest of conflicts. The faces, now gently illuminated, appeared world-weary and amused, recalling that perhaps the true power of entertainment was never in domination, but in the quiet resilience of daily life. As dawn hinted at its approach outside the small, humble tavern, it became clear that even the most chaotic moments drifted into memory, soft echoes of drums, and laughter dissolving into the steady rhythm of ordinary days returned. Somewhere deep in histories uncounted, these moments lingered as subtle reminders of what it meant to find peace in the smallest, most human of performances. As twilight waned over the medieval alehouse, the green dragon's wooden beams seemed to breathe a slow, steady breath, touched by the gentle flicker of candles. A handful of villagers gathered, their faces soft and unhurried, eyes often drifting toward the feeble glow of a lone fire. The music began quietly, a lute strumming a familiar, comforting tune, almost as if it was acknowledging the night's slow conclusion. There was a shared sense of routine in these old walls, a subtle recognition that despite the day's troubles, here, harmony lingered at the edges of everyday life. It was a moment pregnant with the softness of ordinary peace, though none could quite ignore the faint undercurrent of anticipation for the inevitable end of the night. As the evening deepened, a sudden discord arose, a passing dispute over a lost coin, small enough, but carried with unnecessary weight. Someone's voice, a little louder than usual, carried across the room like a ripple disrupting still water. The musicians hesitated briefly, their strings tangling in awkward silence, as if momentarily uncertain whether their tune could mend the crack. The old alehouse seemed to hold its breath, and for a fragile moment it seemed the night might unravel into something less harmonious. Yet as quickly as it had flared, the voices subsided into muted apologies, leaving behind a slight, ironic sense that even disturbances had their place in the slow pulse of tavern life. Humor surfaced quietly, gentle irony in the way the townspeople's arguments often dissolved into bemusement rather than anger, as if they were resigned to their shared human imperfections. The musicians, ever adaptable, picked up their melodies with a subtle eye roll, their fingers moving with a practiced patience. The old faces, blurred by shadows, watched in mild amusement, perhaps remembering similar nights long past. In this understated chaos, the alehouse revealed its true character, an imperfect but resilient community that treasured the small acts of patience and humor. It was, after all, hardly the first time noise had threatened their modest sanctuary, nor would it be the last. A calm gradually settled once more, a gentle lull that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. The candle flames flickered with a softer glow, casting warm, unhurried shadows on the rough plaster walls. The lute resumed its gentle strumming, but with a lighter, more harmonious tone, as if the night's earlier tensions had been gracefully absorbed by the very fabric of the room. The villagers, now more relaxed, dipped bread into their ale and shared quiet smiles, their voices low and steady like a heartbeat. The green dragon, having survived the minor turbulence, seemed to breathe out a slow sigh, contentment quietly deepening within its timbered walls. In the stillness that followed, Aldrich lingered near the door, observing the quiet afterglow of the night's modest stillness. He realized that the alehouse's music was not merely entertainment, but a vital thread woven into the tapestry of their daily existence, a rhythm that held the community together in its imperfect harmony. Faces blurred by light and shadow reminded him of the shared, unspoken stories that passed between neighbors, the small moments that gave life its subtle depth. As he decided to stay, he understood that these nights, slow and quietly enduring, carried the quiet wisdom that even in human imperfection, there is a quiet, enduring beauty in simply being part of the evening's gentle flow. In the quiet, enduring light of early evening, the small tavern of St. Bartholomew opened its creaking door in Locksley's bustling market square, welcoming villagers and traders alike. Inside, The rough wooden table bore the weight of coarse rye bread, its crust cracked and unpretentious, while a steaming bowl of bean pottage waited patiently for hungry hands. The air was filled with the muted clink of mugs, and the faint warmth of weak ale offered little comfort against the chill of the approaching dusk. Innkeeper Matthias, thin and calm, watched quietly as friends exchanged murmured greetings, their faces unevenly lit by a flickering candle. A slight sense of routine settled like dust over the day, unremarkable, yet quietly reassuring in its ordinariness. As hours draped the tavern in shadows, a rumor drifted in, tangled with the smoke and scent of fermented grain, whispers of a pestilence creeping through nearby towns, a shadow darkening the horizon of their minds. Elspeth, the witty barmaid with a careless toss of her hair, raised an eyebrow at the gossip, her smile faint but steady, unsettled only by the silent uncertainty that lurked behind her eyes. Joran, the wandering minstrel, whose songs had long been woven into the fabric of their days, paused mid-tune, his gaze distant, as if pondering the fragile thinness of their collective safety. Conversation slowed, the lively hum dimming into hushed tones, revealing how fragile even the simplest routine could be when fear tiptoed into the edges of their quiet world. There was irony in the way the villagers continued to gather, even as the shadows grew darker and the air thicker with whispered warnings and cautious glances. Matthias chuckled softly, commenting on how folks seemed oddly fond of their weak ale, as if every sip might somehow fortify their spirits against unnameable threats. Elspeth teased her patrons about their hearty appetites for the humble fare, while secretly pondering whether it would be enough if calamity arrived. Joran, with a faint smirk, noted that human beings had always preferred their warnings to come with a side of bread and beans, something tangible amid the intangible fears. The mundane acts persisted, dripping with quiet irony. Life quietly tolerated its own absurdities, even as uncertainty crept in around the edges of the night. Eventually, the crowd settled into a slow, familiar rhythm, mugs lowered on worn oak, eyes softly reflecting the flickering candlelight, and the hum of old stories revisited in whispers. Outside, the wind seemed to carry the distant, muted toll of warning bells. But inside, the tavern remained a sanctuary of the everyday, simple food, weak ale, quiet jesting. Matthias washed and dried another mug, his movements unhurried, his face blurred with the kind of calm that only experience could lend. Elspeth arranged a new bowl of pottage, glancing around with a gentle, knowing smile. And in these small moments of mundane grace, life persisted calmly, quietly resisting the chaos waiting just beyond the door. Looking back, It was in moments like these, where food, drink, and simple human contact anchored them, that they found subtle reassurance. The rumors of pestilence, the threat lurking beyond their modest walls, remained only shadowy uncertainties, unlikely to disturb the quiet rhythm of their days. The faces in the tavern were soft, slightly blurred by the dim light, yet unmistakably real, human, imperfect, enduring. Perhaps, in the slow passage of time, the greatest comfort was in knowing that life's small routines persisted, indifferent to the grand dramas beyond, quietly reminding them of their shared human tendency towards patience and resignation in the face of uncertainty. And so they lingered, waiting for another dawn, another day in the humble hearth of St. Bartholomew. As the cold of winter gradually unwound its grip, the small tavern's wooden beams creaked softly under the weight of the morning light. The regular patrons, their faces lined with familiarity and quiet expectation, settled into their usual shadows, awaiting the familiar taste of their simple ale. Amidst the muted hum of conversation, a newcomer named Aldrich arrived quietly, carrying a clay jar filled with a dark, fragrant brew, an ale unlike any they had tasted before. His secret recipe, infused with a handful of hops, promised a richer, deeper flavor. And though curiosity flickered among the old hands, they hesitated, wary of change. The tavern, a humble vessel of daily routines, now felt slightly more alive with possibilities. Yet the weight of routine made even new beginnings seem slow and distant. Soon, whispers of Aldrich's ale began to ripple through the wooden interior, stirring a faint undercurrent of jealousy among the longest-standing patrons. They eyed his jar with subtle suspicion, their gazes flickering like candle flames in a draught. As days passed, the new brew's popularity grew, and with it, a quiet rivalry took root, one more about pride than taste. Meanwhile, outside in the shadowed courtyard, the well that supplied the town's water began to show troubling signs, greenish tinges, and a faint, sour smell wafted through the air. Matthias, the town's cautious waterer, pondered whether to risk serving the safe but tainted water, or to forego his duty and turn customers away, knowing it might mean a slow demise for his modest establishment. The irony of it all was almost palpable. Aldrich, the outsider with his secret, was now a symbol of prosperity, while the familiar ale, once comforting and predictable, seemed to fade into the background of silent disputes. Regulars, caught in the quiet effort to outwit the unseen microbe in the well, remained at their tables with half-full cups, staring into their drinks as if the answer lay hidden at the bottom. The murmur of conversations shifted, sometimes hushed in uncertainty, sometimes tinged with humor about new brewers and questionable water, as if human stubbornness and mild mockery could stave off the inevitable. Even the faces of the town's old prophets, obscured behind shadows or blurred by the faint glow of a flickering candle, seemed to offer no guidance, their features lost in the mundane passage of time. In the quiet hours of the late afternoon, the tavern settled into a gentle stillness. The patrons, whether sipping the richer ale or cautiously waiting, seemed to accept the slow rhythm of uncertainty. Matthias, with a hand that trembled slightly, poured out a small cup of water from the questionable well, watching the cloudy swirl settle in silence. Aldrich's ale sat untouched in a corner, its dark surface absorbing the dim light, quietly awaiting a decision. Outside, the wind carried no answers, only the soft rustling of leaves. Perhaps, in the stillness, there was a kind of peace, an acknowledgement of human imperfection, and the gentle, unspoken humor that life's small choices often bring. Looking back, the town's brief struggle between tradition and change revealed how fragile the line between safety and risk truly was. The mundane act of serving a simple drink carried the weight of human curiosity and caution, echoing through centuries of quiet existence. The faces in the tavern faded, familiar, unchanging, reminded all present that life unfolds slowly, often unnoticed, with humor nestled quietly in the everyday. As the evening settled, the patrons simply waited, their stories becoming part of an ongoing, unremarkable mosaic of human endurance. The well's contamination lingered in the background, perhaps eventually forgotten. Like so many small human imperfections that made the ordinary world quietly extraordinary. In the dim light of a bustling 14th century tavern, local merchants, farmers, and townfolk gathered to exchange coins and stories. The scent of roasted meats and fresh bread drifting through wooden beams, the tavern keeper, with slow, deliberate movements, laid out a feast of spiced venison and honeyed pastries, their surfaces glistening gently under flickering candlelight. As voices rose and fell in unhurried rhythm, the simple pleasure of shared food and drink felt like an anchor amidst the slow passage of an ordinary day. It was, in its way, a small act of community, routine, predictable, quietly reassuring. Yet beneath this calm, the details hint at the shadows of less obvious care, or the absence of it, lurking just beyond the edges of sight. As the evening wore on, a subtle shift in the room's quiet hum emerged. Guests began to cough softly, their faces momentarily slackening in discomfort, unnoticed in the general warmth of the gathering. Plates and cups of herbal wine circulated, their contents fragrant with the new herbal mixture, meant to delight and soothe. However, the air grew heavier, and some started to clutch their stomachs or lean closer to the wall. The merriment, once gentle and flowing, was gradually tinged with unease, as a few argued softly over their symptoms or excused themselves quietly. It was an unremarkable outbreak, save for the creeping awareness that something unseen had entered the space, something unbidden in the busy city's underbelly of neglected kitchen corners and cellar grime. A faint, ironic echo of this misfortune unfolded in the silent corners. The herbal wine, once praised for its subtle tang, now seemed tinged with the bitter irony of human oversight, its charm diminished by the evident filth that had crept into the cellars, hidden storage. A few villagers, still trying to laugh softly at their discomfort, glanced at each other with tired smiles, as if to acknowledge the mundane tragedy of poor hygiene, an unspoken truth that no amount of spice could fully conceal. The servants, their faces blurred by the dim, warm glow, moved sluggishly around the room, unaware or perhaps resigned to the fact that their careful preparations had been compromised. It was a quiet lesson in the limits of human effort and the persistent presence of grime, which no amount of honey or herbs could wholly hide. Later, as night settled and the symptoms slowly abated for most, the tavern settled into a calmer hush, an almost meditative slow breathing of wood and distant voices. Patrons, now subdued and weary, picked at leftover bread and sipped tepid herbal wine, their faces softened by boredom and mild humor, reflecting on the day's strange turn. The unseen dangers lingered quietly in the background, like the persistent fog that clings to dawn familiar, inevitable, quietly enduring. The innkeeper, with a face blurred in shadows, contemplated the subtle chaos that human negligence often sowed in these humble spaces. It was a moment of reflection, a gentle reminder that safety often rested in the simple, unseen chores of daily life, an ongoing, unglamorous task that was all too easily overlooked. At last, the story of the feast drifted into memory, its minor calamity a distant hum in the slow flow of days, something ordinary, yet quietly instructive. The folk who had gathered learned, in a quiet, unspoken way, that happiness at a feast depended as much on cleanliness as on good company or fine spices. The blurred faces of prophets or sacred figures watched from the shadows of history, their anonymity a symbol of human imperfection, and the faint humor in our persistent efforts. The tavern, now empty, but for the faint scent of herbs and stored grains, seemed to rest under the gentle weight of acceptance, an echo of lives regulated by routine, humility, and an enduring patience for the quiet truths of daily life. In the dim glow of late afternoon, the tavern's stone hearth offered a faint warmth as Matthias leaned over, contemplating the sluggish turn of events. A sudden illness had crept through the townsfolk, leaving faces pale and bodies more tired than usual, casting an unspoken concern over the familiar space. With a slow, deliberate motion, he signaled to have the hearth stoked higher, the coals crackling and blazing to a fiery height. As if trying to burn away the malaise itself, Elspeth moved quietly around, gathering simple herbs, barley, and water, things that seemed ordinary, yet suddenly precious. Outside, the muffled sounds of worried townspeople hovered like a gentle breeze, as everyone waited, unsure if comfort would come from the fire, or the bowl of broth about to be prepared. As the flames licked higher, the hearth's heat seeped into everything. The worn flagstones crackled under the force of the fire, and the air thickened with the scent of ash and boiling water. The room's familiar clutter felt heavier, each small motion rehearsed and deliberate, a slow dance of survival and routine. Meanwhile, Elspeth's hands worked tirelessly, chopping herbs and stirring barley, her movements steady, but shadowed with a faint sense of urgency. The townsfolk, huddled nearby, watched in muted anticipation, voices hushed as if words could somehow tip the fragile balance of health and despair. Matthias's eyes lingered on the flickering flames, noting how they seemed both comforting and relentless, unyielding in their quiet, consuming persistence. Then, in a moment of strange irony, the fire's relentless blaze seemed almost too eager, sparks drifting like mischievous spirits across the low ceiling. The water in the great cauldron spun rapidly, threatening to boil over in a ballet of chaos that seemed both accidental and inevitable. Matthias, with a small shrug, turned up the hearth's dampers, as if to tame the fervor that had turned from purpose to spectacle. Elspeth, with a half-smile, handed out the simple broth, a humble offering that carried the weight of tired hope. The townspeople, gathered closer than before, drank greedily, their trembling hands and grateful eyes hinting at a fragile trust in the hearth, in the food, and perhaps in the quiet care of those who served it. Gradually, the flames subdued into a gentle glow, and the fire's roar softened into a low hum, bringing a calmness that seeped into the corners of the tavern. The once frantic effort to control the fire had settled into a steady rhythm of patience and quiet persistence. Elspeth's calm voice now told stories in her careful, measured tone, her eyes flickering with the soft light of understanding. The grateful murmurs of the townsfolk filled the space like a gentle tide, not loud, but genuine, as the simple broth began to soothe both stomachs and spirits. Outside, the shadows lengthened, settling into the night, leaving behind an atmosphere of ordinary diligence. a reminder that even crises are met most humanly in the slow, ordinary act of caring. Later, as the sky darkened and the fire diminished to embers, Matthias leaned back with a quiet sigh, eyes half closed, watching the flickering hints of warmth that lingered in the corners of the room. The crisis had passed, well short of anything grand, but enough to affirm the quiet strength of small, ongoing efforts. Elspeth cleaned the remnants of the meal, her face softened by a modest smile, as if she understood that each humble act, stoking a fire, preparing a broth, held echoes of resilience in their unassuming way. The townsfolk, now more settled, returned to their seats, comforted subtly by the knowledge that their small community still relied on the slow, continuous rhythm of care. And somewhere in the shadowed corners, amid the remnants of ash and hope, the quiet patience of everyday life endured, unchanged and unassuming, like the fading glow of a tired but steady fire. As the pestilence that had hung heavy over the 14th century, taverns finally eased, the usual hum of conversation and clattering dishes resumed with a cautious sort of optimism. The tavern keepers, sensing a fragile return to normal, resolved to restore order not just to their tables, but to the very air inside their establishments. With weathered hands, they scrubbed wooden surfaces and scrubbed again, as if trying to rinse away the lingering shadows of sickness. New rituals took shape, sweeping corners meticulously, and boiling water for cleaning vessels, all with a quiet belief that cleanliness might fend off future woes. Yet, underneath these efforts lay the slow acknowledgement that human fragility remained, mingling hope with a muted patience for another uncertain season. Soon, a peculiar idea took root among the tavern's proprietors. Brewing a weekly cleanse ale, made with boiling water, to tame both the stomach and the doubt that still whispered softly. The brew was simple, mild, warm, and unassuming, yet it carried a symbolic weight, a potion to wash away the unseen fears. The recipes were carefully recorded, ink smudged from hurried hands, as if marking not just ingredients, but a fragile attempt at permanence. Patrons sipped these newfound elixirs, the steam rising like silent reassurance against the dusky evening light. The act of drinking became both a small comfort and a quiet act of resilience, a ritual of normalcy in uncertain times, even if no one could quite explain why it felt necessary beyond the plain truth of routine. Irony settled gently over the tavern's new customs. The very act of sanitization, once a mundane chore, now seemed oddly at odds with the lively chaos of communal life. Occasionally, a careless hand would drip ale onto the clean tables, revealing that even in attempts at order, human clumsiness persisted, an imperfect dance of effort and error. Visitors chuckled softly at the sight, their faces blurred by the warm hue of flickering candles, and the faintest smile lingered in the corners of some eyes, perhaps at their own inability to perfectly control the chaos. The keeping of records and recipes grew routine, yet a faint tension remained. How long could cleanliness really keep the unseen at bay? Still, each small act of hygiene became a quiet protest against the pervasive whisper of decay. In these calm moments, the tavern felt almost like a sanctuary of mundane persistence, where the hurried scratch of quills and the simmering of boiled water merged into a gentle rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of bread, and the faint, sweet scent of herbal infusions as regulars settled into their seats, eyeing the same familiar faces blurred by the low, golden light. The routines wiping down tables, boiling water, pouring ale, offered a silent meditation on human endurance. The once fraught pressure to eliminate every trace of disease seemed eased by the simple fact of doing these things quietly and regularly. And in this slow, shared habit of maintenance, there was a subtle, unspoken hope that perhaps, just perhaps, life could find its way back softly to a steadier rhythm. Now, as history lingers in the shadows of these small acts, the tavern stands as a quiet testament to human imperfection, an imperfect attempt at hygiene, at hope, at normalcy. The blurred presence of figures long gone reminds us that even the most diligent rituals are imperfect shields against time and chaos. Looking back, it seems almost trivial, these routines of wiping, brewing, recording. Yet, they speak to a universal human patience, the slow, steady effort to make life a little more bearable in the face of relentless change. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in this gentle rhythm of everyday persistence, a quiet acknowledgement that amid the inevitable decay, small acts of care quietly carve meaning into the fabric of ordinary life. In the quiet town of Brindleford, the Oak and Ember Tavern opened its weathered doors at dusk, inviting local faces to gather beneath its low, beamed ceiling. Mara, the innkeeper, arranged empty mugs and wiped her hands on a faded cloth as the first few customers drifted in, their voices folding into the ambient hum of scraping stools and simmering fires. This modest establishment, unassuming in its plainness, gradually evolved into a space where gossip and trade mingled softly, unnoticed by the larger world, but vital to daily life. The shadows cast by flickering lanterns played on the faces of merchants and townsfolk alike, blurring their features into familiar, gentle masks. It was a quiet beginning, marked more by small gestures and sighs than by any grand purpose. Yet it quietly promised the unraveling of the town's subtle stories. As evening deepened, the tavern's atmosphere shifted with a slight undercurrent of tension, an unspoken awareness of agendas slipping between beers and shared bread. Joran, a charismatic merchant with quick eyes and a broader smile, leaned against the rough-hewn countertop, exchanging quiet words with Rurik, the local constable. Rurik's heavy shoulders and thoughtful gaze suggested he was already weighing more than just tavern gossip. Perhaps the faint scent of impending authority or trouble. Conversations hushed as new patrons listened, eyes flickering toward the sturdy door, awaiting the next story, decision, or command to pass from behind the bar. The warmth in the room contrasted sharply with the colder, distant echoes of distant conflicts that occasionally seeped through the thick wooden walls. Amid the usual lull, the irony of their gathering became subtly apparent. These conversations, meant to build trust and order, often danced around unresolved disputes and quiet ambitions. Mara, serving behind the bar, watched in a half-smile as the trio's words fluttered between camaraderie and calculation, like moths circling a muted flame. The faces of prophets or sages that once shimmered in the older tavern stories remained unseen, obscured by shadow and light. Yet their absence underscored how little had truly changed. Gossip, as ever, was both balm and weapon, whispering truths and fears with equal ease. The inn, with all its humble solidity, seemed undeniably a vessel of human imperfections, gently revealing how fragile and how persistent local power could be. Later, the tavern settled into a calm rhythm, the evening's whispers giving way to a stillness that felt almost contemplative. Mara leaned against the counter, her glance drifting to the faint flicker of lanterns spilling soft amber across wooden surfaces, as if the place itself was quietly pondering the stories it had supported. Joran's grin softened into a contemplative smile, while Rurik's broad frame relaxed into the slow cadence of mundane matters. Nothing urgent, just the slow ticking of community life, the blurred faces of prophets or distant rulers continued to drift beyond view, as if reminding all present of how easily history's great narratives fade into shadow, leaving behind only muted human echoes. At last, the tavern's gentle pulse seemed to suggest that some stories do not need dramatic unraveling. They simply drift, like leaves on a quiet stream. Reflecting quietly on these gatherings, it seemed almost inevitable that a tavern such as the Oak and Ember, so ordinary in its daily rituals, was a mirror to the town's soul. Small decisions, whispered hopes, and unseen power played out in these slow moments of shared drunkenness, setting invisible threads through the fabric of Brindleford. Mara's Mara's steady presence, Joran's charm, and Rurik's measured silence formed an unspoken understanding that the true strength of the town was held not in grand buildings or loud proclamations, but in the subtle, ongoing conversations that intertwined law, trade, and gossip. With each evening's waning light, the tavern remained a quiet witness to the slow, modest currents shaping the community, an unpretentious stage where human stories, imperfect and unremarkable, quietly persisted into the night. In the quiet embrace of dusk, the tavern's hearth flickered softly, casting warm orange shadows on the rough-hewn wooden tables. Mara observed the familiar faces, a merchant's heavy-lidded eyes, a local smith's rumpled shirt, the occasional shuffle of boots against the flagstone floor. The ambient hum of conversations blended with the gentle crackle of burning wood, creating an atmosphere of mundane continuity. It was here, amid this simple chaos, that gossip found its way from overheard whisper to unwitting record, as if the hearth itself held a memory of the town's secrets. Mara, half listening, understood that these moments of quiet chatter were the threads that wove the fabric of local power, thin, fragile, but ever present. One evening, an uneven voice broke through the familiar murmur, whispering of a hidden tax, an unheard levy intended to fund the town's expansion. Concealed beneath the veneer of ordinary tavern talk, the words drifted like smoke, slow and diffuse, yet sharp enough to catch the attention of a few sharp-eyed listeners. Rumors spread like slow-burning fire, igniting quiet tensions between the merchant guild and the town council, each suspecting the other of hidden agendas. Mara felt a flicker of unease, recognizing that this simple secret had the weight to topple alliances forged over years of barter and shared bread. As the hearth glowed softly, she pondered how easily honest words could turn into dangerous, yet invisible weapons of influence. Irony settled quietly over the scene as Mara realized the hearth, this humble, smoky center of the tavern, was more than just a place for warmth. It was, in some sense, a conduit for the unwritten diplomacy of the town, where truths and lies blended without clear boundary. Gossip, like gentle flames, spread from lip to ear, twisting unforeseen until it reached a tipping point. A merchant's casual comment might ripple outward, reshaping allegiances with a subtlety that resembled the flickering light, beautiful, fleeting, and easily lost. Mara observed how those living in ordinary days, unknowingly, became part of a grand, slow-moving game, where silence sometimes carried more weight than spoken words. The night grew deeper, and Mara found herself pondering the strange calm that followed turbulent whispers. She noticed the hearth's glow gently illuminating her thoughts, casting no shadows of shame or triumph, only quiet acceptance. In these moments, she understood that the truths kept within the tavern, and perhaps within herself, were weightier than the gossip that fluttered through the air like moths. The town's affairs spun on, indifferent to her moral dilemma, as ordinary people went about their routines, unaware of how delicate their shared stories really were. The rhythm of daily life persisted, slow and unremarkable. Yet beneath that calm lay the unending dance of influence and silence. Reflecting upon that evening, Mara saw the tavern's hearth less as a source of gossip and more as a mirror of human nature's quiet absurdities, our small, persistent desire to know, to hide, and to influence without recognition, the hidden tax, the fleeting rumors, the blurred faces of prophets and rulers, all disappeared into the gentle light of that ordinary night, leaving behind only the soft echo of human imperfection. She understood that in the grand, slow story of towns and inns, humility often lay in the acknowledgement of how little we truly control. And perhaps in these quiet, unremarkable moments, there is a kind of freedom, an acceptance that, like the hearth's faint glow, everything flickers and fades, leaving only the warmth of shared human silence. In the quiet murmur of the tavern's early evening light, the old inn seemed to breathe with the slow passage of everyday life. Men and women came and went, their faces unremarkable but familiar, touched by the warm glow of lanterns that flickered softly on weathered wood. Somewhere in the background, the clink of mugs and quiet hum of conversation created a subtle rhythm, almost like the heartbeat of the town itself. It was here, amid the familiar scent of ale and baked bread, that the first murmurs of secret alliances began to stir, unnoticed by most ordinary days, yet quietly holding the fragile threads of local power, woven through glances and hushed words. Life moved on, slow and steady, in the shadowed corners of a simple inn that watched it all go by. As dusk settled deeper, the mood in the tavern shifted imperceptibly, and behind a heavy curtain in the back room, alliances started to tighten in the dimness. Joran, a merchant with a lingering smile, passed a small pouch to Rurik, whose brow furrowed thoughtfully while accepting the bribe. Outside that secret chamber, the tension was nearly unnoticeable, a fleeting ripple in the quiet hum of routine, yet undeniably present. Meanwhile, Lysa, the farmer's wife, sat quietly in the corner, clutching a worn cloth with trembling fingers, as she plotted with Mara to reveal the quiet corruption that seeped into the town's coffers. It was a fragile moment, half betrayal, half hope, as each side tried to tilt the scales just a little more in their favor. An ordinary night with extraordinary quiet schemes unfolding, an irony not lost on the inn's unblinking, shadowed walls. Irony settled gently like dust in the slowly cooling air. The more these secret negotiations intensified, the more the inn's simple facade masked the tangled stories within. Joran's early friendliness now felt tinged with suspicion, his smiles a little too cautious as he joked about fair trade, while Rurik's eyes occasionally flicked to the door, as if wary of eavesdroppers. Across the room, Lysa's candid hope for exposure clashed quietly with her fears of unseen consequences, her words deliberate but trembling. Mara, with her quiet poise, seemed to weigh each move carefully, her face hidden behind a curtain of shadow, her expressions unfocused, as if to suggest an unseen, deliberate facade. The rustic hum of the tavern persisted, almost mocking how these dramas played out beneath its unchanging ceiling. It was all so human, a dance of power, irony, and unspoken truths, quietly humbling in its ordinariness. Eventually, the night drew a gentle curtain over the turbulent threads of the story, and the tavern returned to its softer rhythms, as if nothing had truly changed. The hurried whispers faded into regular conversations, and the resilience of routine seemed to offer a kind of quiet peace, even amid underlying tensions. Joran's reluctant smile, Rurik's cautious nod, Lysa's quiet hope, all settled into a kind of uneasy coexistence, as if the town had simply decided to forget the shadows for now. Mara's subtle watchfulness remained, a calm sentinel amid the unremarkable scene. With the flickering lanterns casting a gentle glow on tired faces, the inn felt like a place where stories paused, a moment of peaceful reflection before the quiet tide of everyday life resumed. Nothing was decided, and life, as always, moved forward at its unhurried, inevitable pace. In the stillness of the early morning, the tavern was once again an ordinary place, touched only faintly by the faint memory of entanglements past. Light streamed lazily through small windows, illuminating battered tables and the frost-edged glass of unused mugs. The secret meetings that had once crackled with tension now felt far away, stories stored quietly at the back of minds, under layers of routine and quiet resignation. The faces, blurred by light or shadow, carried their small burdens and hopes, each waiting for another day to begin. The inn seemed to hold the slow weight of history, quietly observing how human stories would continue, slightly absurd, painfully human, and gently inevitable. Reflecting on it all, the lessons lingered in the calm. How ordinary places often cradle the most subtle shifts, without grand spectacle or fanfare, only the quiet persistence of human nature. On a quiet evening, when the sky had settled into a muted gray, the Oak and Ember Inn welcomed its usual patrons, whose voices rose softly over the clinking of glasses and the crackling of a small hearth. The town's gossip quieted into hushed whispers, yet beneath the surface, plans and alliances brewed silently like the slow movement of the tide. At the bar, old-timers exchanged mundane tales of local affairs, assuming their words drifted unseen by any but themselves, unaware of the shifting undercurrents shaping their quiet world. The inn's worn wooden beams seemed to hold the weight of generations, silently observing the daily ballet of small human ambitions. It was, in every small detail, a place of simple rituals, drinks poured, stories shared, and secrets kept. Or so it seemed, until the night's quiet rhythm was about to be disturbed. As midnight approached, a twinge of tension unfurled quietly in the tavern, fueled by whispers of hidden taxes and clandestine dealings that had long been buried beneath surface civility. Heated words emerged, slow and deliberate, like footsteps measured on cold stone, revealing cracks in the carefully maintained facade of town authority. Shadows flickered across faces blurred by the half-light, as accusations flew, some unfounded, others too close to truth, cloaked in irony and quiet annoyance. Somewhere behind the scenes, a ledger or a document slipped from a sleeve, revealing the concealed details of financial dealings that could threaten long-standing power. The shift from mundane conviviality to open confrontation seemed almost inevitable, as if the inn itself had been holding its breath for this moment of quiet reckoning. An odd sense of irony settled like dust as the argument spilled into the open, unmasking the absurdity of secrecy in a place where everyone knew everyone's secrets, yet pretended not to. The revealed documents, hastily flung onto the rough table, showed figures and notes that made only partial sense. Powerful men suddenly caught in the small, awkward light of exposure. The room, thick with the smell of spilled ale and cold stone, echoed with the soft murmur of broken serenity, punctuated by a sudden clash of voices and clattering chairs. In this moment, the quiet comedy of human effort to control unseen forces was laid bare, an irony that even the most cunningly preserved facades could not withstand the simple truth of shared spaces and human fallibility. The inn's warmth gave way to a brittle tension that lingered in the air as the night stretched on. Eventually, as tempers cooled and the shouting subsided, the inn settled back into a calm state of reflection, like a body gently settling after a storm. Patrons, some with smudges of ink from hastily scribbled notes, exchanged glances that carried a quiet understanding. The fragile nature of local power, held in the hands of ordinary humans, was always just one reveal away from chaos. The shadows cast by the flickering lanterns danced lazily across faces that now seemed more human, less inflated by authority. Conversation resumed, softer this time, with a cautious humor about the night's absurdities, as if everyone appreciated the unspoken agreement that life, beneath thin layers of civility, was often just a game of polite pretenses. The inn's worn walls, silent witnesses, seemed to exhale gently into the night's stillness. In the calm of early dawn, as the shadows lengthened and the tavern's usual clatter diminished into distant memories, the townspeople carried the quiet knowledge of their shared human imperfections. The midnight confrontation, fleeting yet revealing, had threaded another subtle stitch into the fabric of local history, proof that beneath all whispered schemes and hidden papers, it was human weakness and ordinary folly that truly shaped their world. The oak and ember stood quietly as always, its weathered sign swaying gently in the morning breeze, indifferent yet observant of the stories played out within and beyond its walls. Human ambition, secrets, and irony merged quietly into the background hum of everyday life. Softer even than the night it had temporarily disturbed, an eternal reminder of the slow, unremarkable march of human effort and folly. As the dust of recent disputes settled over Brindleford, the tavern remained quietly unchanged, its oak beams and worn countertop bearing witness to countless mornings of slow gatherings. The town's council, weary of the constant bickering, finally enacted reforms. Yet the whispers persisted both within and beyond the tavern's walls, faint echoes that carried more weight than formal decrees. The merchant guild, which once wielded influence through wealth and strict trade hours, subtly retreated, perhaps realizing that control was now slipping into more humble hands. Meanwhile, Mara, whose face often blurred into shadow behind the bar, stood still as dawn's early light seeped through a small window, watching the day unfold in gentle patience. In that quiet moment, she understood that the tavern had become a repository of shared truths, where gossip and perception quietly shaped the fabric of local life, more enduring than any law or agreement. With the reforms in place, a tentative calm settled on the town. Yet beneath that calm, the small tensions shimmered like faint ripples through still water. Mara noticed the subtle shifts, an old customer's hesitant smile, a new face lingering over a mug longer than necessary, as if searching for something unsaid. The council's decisions, though publicly praised, did little to silence the murmurs that traveled from lip to ear, carried across the linoleum and wooden floors of the tavern. Its patrons, now more mindful of what was whispered in dim corners, began to realize that their words had weight, and that little fires of gossip could spark larger disagreements. Still, the tavern offered a sanctuary of sorts, a place where fears and hopes mingled over pints, with the unspoken understanding that human imperfection often thrived in quiet corners of simple life. It was almost amusing how, over time, the tavern had come to eclipse the formal powers of the town as the center of influence, a contradiction that might have made folks smile if they weren't so tired. The merchants who once dictated trade routes now found themselves listening more intently in a different way, their influence ebbing as conversations at the bar wove stories that settled deeper into the community's collective mind. Mara, with her steady gaze and half-empty glass, observed how the scattered voices formed an unofficial thread that connected everyone, rarely loud, often humorous in their subtle irony. Behind the blurred faces of prophets or elders, unseen shadows of ancient authority lingered, but it was the hum of daily gossip that truly dictated how Brindleford's stories and reputations took shape. Ironies, she thought quietly, how power quietly shifted from statute to stories, and from leaders to listeners. Eventually, as the seasons drifted softly into one another, the tavern settled into its status as the town's quiet heart, a place where time moved slowly, unnoticed. Mara's hands moved with practiced ease, prepared pints, and listened, always listening, for the honest truths that slipped between words. The sunrise found her watching from a corner, a gentle smile touching her lips as light basked the worn oak in warm hues. Over the years, the tavern had become more than a meeting place. It had become the keeper of memory, an unofficial archive of what mattered, softly curated through everyday conversations. The town's bulk of history, like its stories, was stored here, mundane and yet vital, shaped by countless small interactions that built its visible and invisible backbone. Here in the quiet, human stories endured, imperfect, humorous, and quietly resilient. Mara understood, as she watched the sunrise unfold across the quiet town, that Brindleford's future would be woven into the slow unfolding of those everyday moments. The oak and ember would continue to be more than a tavern. It was a vessel of shared life, a gentle anchor amid the quiet shifts of power and opinion. The blurred faces of prophets and politicians may have once held the illusions of certainty, but now it was the faces of ordinary people, tired yet steadfast, that kept the town's heart beating in gentle rhythm. She thought about how the stories told in this place, sometimes humorous, sometimes haunting, were the true foundation of local memory, quietly shaping destinies in ways subtle and profound. With the dawn's light touching her face, Mara knew that even in slow days and quiet words, the essence of Brindleford's story would continue, softly and slowly, into whatever tomorrow might bring.